Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation and for being part of such an interesting process. I've tentatively titled my talk Placing the 1945 Manchester Congress in Pan-Africa in Literature and in International Law. And I want to think about placing as well. So hang on to placing as an idea. What does it mean to place something somewhere and not somewhere else? And what form does that place take? So just to begin, so W.B. Du Bois, the father of Pan-Africanism, began his 1921 unpublished essay, News from Pan-Africa, as follows. Etymologically, Transcaucasia was the term I preferred, but with the Tiflis and oil, the Bolshevin and Baku, the name has been more than preemptive, despite its lying so appropriately on the Black Sea. But the Black Sea of which I write lies much farther away from Russia. It lies even beyond Africa, and is in that geographical third dimension of fixed ideas, which makes it unusually difficult to approach. And despite our stream of travel, the cables of Yap, and the swift-flying trains and steamers, somehow news and embassies from this land beyond the white world filter even more slowly than before the war. So this imagined Pan-Africa that Du Bois speaks of, he goes on to suggest, is not the Africa of the white world, of economic empire, but its antithesis. It is, quote, the thought of the vast African present. Not only the African present, but the past and the future. This Pan-Africa includes Africa, but spiritually more than physically. In fact, it's an isolated, indefinite, little-known region, the non-existence of which experienced and lettered folk could easily disprove. So I thought that might be an interesting place to start because I've just come back from Georgia, from the other side of the Black Sea to Manchester to talk about Pan-Africanism. So if I'm ever going to use Du Bois's essay to reflect on Pan-Africanism, this would be the moment. And so I started to think how might we tell the story of Pan-Africanism as a project through these ideas of imagination and place. And in particular, because a lot of my more recent work is using literature, I wanted to hold on to the imagination. So what I'm going to try to do today is tell the story of Pan-Africanism using three vignettes or three different novels that in different ways reflect on the development of Pan-Africanism and how they suggest a relationship to imagination and a relationship to place, and how those two collapse after the formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. So taking the themes of Du Bois's essay, I want to tell the story of Pan-Africanism, an attempt to imagine Africa's place in the international order and reimagine the international order in the process. The gradual narrowing of the horizons of the possibility of that reimagination to those of international law, a liberal, formally non-racial order of states, and the failure to meet those horizons in the case of Biafra. And this is where Manchester lies. Manchester lies at the center of the story of Pan-Africanism. The Congress happens in 1945 in Manchester, and the story begins after World War I, and Versailles ends possibly with Biafra. We might say it ended with the decision of the ICJ in 1966. So it's a story that spans, and Manchester's a pivot. And in doing so, I'm going to use literature because I'm interested in how imagination works in modern literature. And in particular, I'm going to speak about three novels. So the first novel is Du Bois's Dark Princess, which is an account of the attempts of post-World War I Pan-Africanist congresses to reimagine the international as a truly universal space. And Du Bois is particularly interesting because this is his second novel, but his favorite, what he would say would be his favorite novel. And as the father of Pan-Africanism, the novel comes at a time when Pan-Africanism is in a decline. So you can see the novel as a way that he externalizes all his hopes and dreams of a failed project of Pan-Africanism. The second novel I want to talk about is by Peter Abrahams, who in fact was in Manchester in 1945. He's a South African novelist, inspired by Du Bois as well. He organized a conference with Kwame Nkrumah, and he wrote a novel called A Wreath for Udoma, which is an account of Pan-Africanism in London and Manchester in the 1930s and 1940s, and also the failure of the first independent state of Ghana. And it's kind of a Roman clef. So there's a sense that Abrahams is writing from the inside, knowing Kwame Nkrumah, knowing Kenyatta, knowing George Padmore, having met Du Bois. There's kind of a sense that he knows what's going on. And so the novel's read in a particular way, and I want to try and read the novel in order to show how place plays a particular role in that novel and how we can replace the state in international law. And that was in fact what Pan-Africanists were trying to do in the 1940s. And the third novel I want to talk about is Cyprian Akwensi's Divided We Stand, which is an account of the failure of Pan-Africanism and the failure of international law and the failure of the OAU in Biafra. And how that novel, and he has a chapter in it called Afro-Chaos, which is essentially a parody of African Union and parody of Pan-Africanism, and how that sort of holds in place a particular moment in Pan-Africanism and the failure of, in fact, Du Bois's and Nkrumah's visions. So let me begin with The Dark Princess. So The Dark Princess was written by Du Bois, as I said, in 1928. It's essentially an international romance. It's called The Dark Princess of Romance. It tells the story of an ill-fated romance between an educated cosmopolitan African-American, Matthew Towns, Du Bois, and a Princess Cortelia, a ruler of a fictitious Indian kingdom of Wadpo. I guess I can't pronounce that wrong because it's not a real place. So the story begins in Berlin in August 1923, where Matthew meets and falls in love with Princess Cortelia. The princess is a member of the Great Committee of the Darker Peoples, an international alliance of representatives of the darker nations struggling against the white world imperialism. The princess invites Matthew to join the Great Committee as a representative of the state called Pan-Africa, whatever that means. And the two of them are forced apart by circumstances and duties. They fall in love, and ultimately at the end of the novel, the princess writes to Matthew to say, "The great central committee of yellow, brown, and black is finally to meet. You are a member. The high command is to be chosen. 10 years of preparation are set, 10 more years of final planning, and then 5 years of intensive struggle. In 1952, the dark world goes free. Whether in peace and fostering friendship with all men, or in blood and storm, it is for them, the pale masters of today, to say." And it's quite an interesting time. He's writing in 1928, 1952, you think of Bandung in 1955, so it's not, the timeline works quite well. So while he was feeling particularly not very positive about the chances of this being something that would happen without blood and storm in 1928, he had been trying, in fact, Du Bois for 10 years to try and set both the Dark World free and the Pale Masters free in peace and fostering. And he'd been trying to do this through Pan-Africanism. So the novel sets up the end of the first period of Pan-Africanism, which we could say begins in 1919 with the first Congress and ends around 1924. It tells a particular story that's mainly about Du Bois. So mainly about Du Bois. So Du Bois's plan to reimagine the international through something called the Pan-African Congress can be traced back to his very early statement at the turn of the century at the first Pan-African Conference in 1900 that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And this is something that he repeats in Souls of Black Folk and repeats again in a few other novels. And really, though, he starts to formulate what this might look like in 1917 when he starts thinking about the end of World War I. And he starts writing up essays about what to do with the colony of Germany after the end of World War I. And his first essay, which starts in about 1917, he starts making a draft, is called Africa and the Peacemakers, and he proposes the creation of a new African world state, a black Africa drawn from the colonial possessions of Germany, followed by those of Portugal and Belgium, and eventually all the other colonial powers, except for South Africa. This new African world state would initially be governed through the same international control by which we hope to govern the world for peace, the League of Nations. And ultimately the aim was ultimately to rebuild the world with compact nations, empires of self-governing elements, and colonies of backward people under benevolent international control. This, however, and temporarily phrased, was Du Bois's dream in 1919, a world African state under benevolent international control, a Pan-Africa. So the memorandum finishes with Du Bois saying that essentially this Pan-Africa is not simply about the emancipation of Africans. He says that through this African state, if we will, inaugurate on the Dark Continent the last great crusade for humanity. With Africa redeemed, Asia would be safe, and Europe would be triumphant. So this is a Du Bois beginning as Pan-Africanism, but with a view to try reimagine the international through the insertion of an African world state into the international system. And he's fairly confident about his chances of being at the top of that hierarchy. So it's as a side note, it's interesting to point out that every time Du Bois proposes there should be a League of Nations commission or some kind of extensive involvement, he's somewhere on that commission. It's very clear that this is something that he's going to do. And he actually gets pretty close at one point. He addresses the League of Nations and actually has a fairly effective role to play. Anyway, so the memorandum itself gets bundled off and sent to Robert Lansing, Newton Baker from the War Department, and Wilson. No one knows what happens to this memorandum. I try to track it down at the various archives of these individuals. I haven't found it. What we do know is that at some point, it does get to Wilson. At some point in time, when Wilson's on the boat going across to Versailles, he comes up with the idea of the mandates. Right? And Du Bois now would say for the rest of time that Du Bois actually had the idea for the mandates, which is normally accredited to Jan Smuts or various other people. So the timing's unsure. Du Bois would say this until his death. In 1959, he'd stand in front of Fanon and say, "I came up with the mandates," which is pretty bold given what we know the mandates turned out to be. But he made this claim pretty consistently, we don't really know. But part of the memorandum was this idea of having a conference. And so he suggested that there should be a series of conferences to ascertain the desires, aspirations, grievances of these people, and to incorporate to some extent the plans for the reconstruction of the world in the reconstruction of the world, the desires of these people. And that's essentially what the first Pan-African Congress was. He arranged it in Paris. He took his memorandums. He tried to use the conference to just to get the memorandum adopted. He had very severe resistance from Blaise Diagne, who was the French Minister for the Colonies. And what came out of it, the ultimate resolutions of the Pan-African Congress of 1919, was a fairly watered-down version of the memorandum. Importantly, what had happened to the memorandum in particular was that it had become more state-friendly. So references to the international became references to state and self-determination, and this was at the insistence of the French. But the final point of that resolution of the 1919 Pan-African Congress recalled the idea of the Dark Princess, of the redemption of the international through the inclusion of Africa in it, was that greater security of life and property shall be guaranteed the natives, international labor legislation shall cover the native workers as well as whites, they shall have equitable representation in all the international institutions of the League of Nations, and participation of the blacks themselves in every domain of endeavor shall be encouraged. So, read together, reading the Pan-African Congress and the subsequent events, and in particular the Dark Princess, Du Bois's Pan-African internationalism was unshaken. In between the romantically configured past and his imagined future lay the international present. For Du Bois, it was through the international that both Africans and the darker races would be redeemed, and in future in turn would redeem humanity. It was his first and foremost this romanticized conception of the international that grounded his artistic, historical, and political projects. And it's interesting, if you think that the timing of the Dark Princess is particularly interesting, if you think about an essay he wrote, I think in 1926, about the criteria for Negro art, which was where he wrote his famous thing about how all art is propaganda and ever it should be. And he had a particular quote where he suggested, so his aim was to seek with beauty to set the world right. And so in a sense you can read the Dark Princess as his attempt to seek with beauty to set the world right. It's also at the time in 1928 when he writes to a friend and colleague Dantes Bellegarde, who was a Haitian diplomat who had helped him address the League of Nations, and said that essentially Pan-Africanism was dead as a project because his people lacked an international conscience. They were too parochial, too bound up in their own politics, and so the way that he would express, the way that he would push back or externalize the failures of Pan-Africanism and the failures he saw of his people to imagine the world internationally or to reimagine it, was to write a novel to encourage them to get that, what he would call international conscience. So that's the first vignette. That's Dark Princess. That's a sense of how to reimagine the international through, to reimagine Africa into the international and then reimagine the international in the process. So the next is Reeth voor Dome, which was by Peter Abrahams. Now Peter Abrahams was a South African who had left South Africa in 1939. As I say, came to Manchester, came to London initially and met George Padmore, was part of the group of Pan-Africanists, was part of the organizing committee for the Pan-African Congress, was of those people. He didn't go back to South Africa, he became an artist. I think C.L.R. James once called him a cafe intellectual. C.L.R. James had this sort of, George Padmore called him and C.L.R. James Padmore cafe intellectuals, because they were too interested in writing books, not enough in political actions. And in fact, he was the first choice of Padmore to go to Bandung, and he refused to go because they fell out over various reasons. Anyway, so he left by the early 1950s. Peter Abrahams had fallen out with some of the people who were part of the Pan-African group of the 1940s and had sort of grown distance from others and been disillusioned by some, and he writes this novel called Reeth voor Dome. And it's remarkable in many respects. It's remarkable because it is a romantic clef by one of the most key figures in Pan-Africanism, written in 1956 on the cusp of Ghana's independence. And it reads as if he had some kind of foresight into what was going to happen. So it's a remarkably prescient critique of what would become the typical post-colonial novel. So he's writing in 1956, but he predicts that that Nkrumah will fall out with his friends, and there will be an excess there'll be a struggle for power with tribal powers, that he would take money from abroad to build a big dam in Ghana, and that would mean he'd be tired and he'd sell out his friends. It's incredibly, the geopolitics of the novel are before their time. And so that's one of the reasons why it's read a particular way. But just to give you a sense of the characters in it. So there's two parts to the novel. The first is called The Dream, which is an insider account of Pan-Africanism in London and Manchester in the first part of 1940. And the second is called The Reality, which is the return of these various individuals who were planning decolonization and Pan-African struggles in Africa, back to Africa. The novel is read as a critique of Nkrumah, Kenyatta, and Padmore. So there's characters in the novel that are kind of complexes of different people. Michael Ludoma, who's the main character, is most likely a combination of Nkrumah with a little bit of Kenyatta. There's a David Mendy character who's a freedom fighter born from an estate called Pluralia, which is actually South Africa, or in Kenya, who's probably a bit of Kenyatta. There's a Richard Aboy, who's a sort of prototype of Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first Prime Minister of Nigeria. There's a character called Paul Marby, who's a sort of disaffected artist, which is Abrams writing how he thinks Padmore sees him, so it's quite meta in how he forms it. And there's this sort of tragic character called Tom Landwood. Tom Landwood is I think an American who is trying to fight for the freedom of Africa, but feels this disconnect. And he's of both Padmore and Richard Wright, in fact, as well. So some of the dialogue that's taken in the novel is specifically from encounters, from interactions that Wright had with Peter Abrahams over his disaffection at going back to Africa and not being recognized by anyone. No one knew who he was, and this is sort of one of the characters that comes into the novel. So what's remarkable, it's an interesting novel to read because it seems to be ahead of its time, but that comes with a very particular problem. Right, so the novel's read anachronistically. The novel's read as if reading back as what we know happens afterwards, and this has a particular effect on how we understand it. So it's read in the light of subsequent political events in Ghana and Africa, in particular the post-colonial turn in African literature. So it's read as a strong and straightforward critique of Kwame Nkrumah and the Gold Coast revolutions, and generally it's read as referring to Ghana as Pan-Africa. So Pan-Africa, the country that they go to liberate, is read as understood as being the state of Ghana, and Nkrumah as being its first leader. And as in the result, the perceived failings of Nkrumah's Ghana are then read back into the novel, despite the fact that Abraham's novel was written prior to the events that happened in Ghana. And the best example of this, the tendency to read what we know now back into the novel, to conflate the characters too closely, is if you look for an entry in the Encyclopedia of Literary Characters of 2015 on Rithfu Odomo, they have a description of Michael Odomo. They say, a Pan-African who leads his country's opposition to colonialism, a central characteristic of Odomo is that even while a doctoral student in England, he's devoted to his country's liberation. Now, he wasn't a doctoral student in England, that's Nkrumah. So Odomo in the novel never was a doctoral student, never had any relationship, and so there's a tendency literally to just collapse these two into one another. And once you understand the characters as being complexes and pluralia is not necessarily, Pan-African not necessarily being Ghana, you get a second reading, and that reading is the one that I'm interested in unpacking. So what's remarkable about the novel in terms of its geopolitics or its imagination is that there's no states. There's very few states. So in the novel there's something called Pan-Africa, which is read normally as being Ghana. There's a place called Pluralia, which is clearly South Africa most of the time, but sometimes Kenya as well. There's a place called Europe, which is just Europe. There's an actor called the Council of Nations, which is presumably the United Nations. So it's for a novel that's supposed to be about the geopolitics of independence, there's very few states. And if you hold on to the idea that perhaps the novel has been written not exclusively with Ghana in mind, then you can make an argument that Pan-Africa was in fact all of Africa. It was the Pan-African state that Du Bois had been thinking about in 1919. And in fact, when you read it in those terms, it actually makes a lot more sense in terms of how the novel unfolds. So how the novel unfolds is essentially a struggle between Pan-Africa, this continental state, and Pluralia, South Africa. There's this white settler colony, and there's no interstate, there's no intra-African or intra-states cooperation. There's simply one big entity called Pan-Africa and one other entity called South Africa. And so when you take out the over-reliance on Nkrumah and subsequent history, you can read the novel as essentially predicting not the independence of Ghana, but the realization of the Pan-African dream of a continent, of an organization of African state, of a United States of Africa. And in fact, if you go into the biography of it, Peter Abrahams, who was under the tutelage of Padmore, was very clear on this being the purpose of the organization of Pan-Africanism, was the formation of a single African Pan-Africa state, so an organization in the United States of Africa. And in fact, in some of the Dorothy Faza, who was, if I'm not mistaken, the partner of Padmore, in some of her relations and letters she wrote to Peter Abrahams, used the description Pan-Africa, used the term Pan-Africa to describe what would become the single state of Africa, the single United States of Africa. And so reading that novel, reading into the resolutions of the Congress, so one of the resolutions of the Congress of 1945 was that the artificial divisions and territorial boundaries created by the imperialist power are deliberate steps to obstruct the political unity of West African peoples. So there was a sense in the resolutions themselves that the colonial borders were up for grabs, that we have to imagine ourselves outside of the states that we've been given, certainly, and perhaps out of the states altogether. And so Wreath for Adomo allows you to reread those resolutions as perhaps anticipating something other than what was going to come, which was simple, deep self-determination within the parameters of the states left by colonialism. And that critique of what might happen if we did that, if Pan-Africa went along that route, is then brought through in the next novel. So the next novel, so that's Pan-Africanism in the 1940s. The next novel jumps ahead a bit in time. And this is different, I must say, because Du Bois and the Abrahams novels are interesting to read because those were people who had insider knowledge of Pan-Africanism. Cyprian Ekwenzi novel on Biafra, Divided We Stand, is written in 1980. He's not an insider, but still there's something that he does in the novel. His description of Pan-Africanism in the novel is something that can be read back to describe or to understand what happened to Pan-Africanism in the late 50s and early 60s, and in particular to understand what happened when self-determination did happen in those borders and the Organization of African Unity decided to adopt liberal, formally non-racial international law as the basis for its organization, or for the basis for institutionally for the way that it regulated its borders and its relationships with other African states. So Ekwenzi's Divided We Stand places the responsibility, is about the Biafran War, and I should say it's allegedly written, he wrote 2 novels about the Biafran War. He also wrote a very famous novel called People of the Cities. He's one of the better known African novelists. Divided We Stand is one of the most read, probably the most read novel about the Biafran War. He wrote another one called Survive the Peace, which he wrote, I think, in 1971, 72. The one he published in 1980, this Divided We Stand, he said he wrote during the war, but there's no evidence that he did that. It's most likely written around about the late 70s. And what's interesting about this novel is all the Biafran novels have a sort of similar focus on the international as part of, if not all of, the problem with Biafra. So Biafra is the failed Biafran succession. There's often blame is placed for that on the international. In particular, blame is placed on the international in racial terms. So that the failure of Biafra to self-determine is understood as not as a Cold War problem, because both the British and the Americans and the Russians supported the federal government. It's understood as the continuation of Pan-African, or the continuation of a global color war, or the global war against black self-determination. And a few novelists actually make this very clear. So there's a novel, for example, by Eddie Ara called Siren in the Night, where the biography of the main character who's fighting in Biafra is someone who came to Manchester for the Pan-African Congress and then went to Nkrumah and studied in Ghana, and following the arrest of Nkrumah then went straight to Biafra. So there's a sort of sense through the biography of the main character to continue to make Biafra be a continuation to some extent, somehow, of the Pan-Africanist project. So, of all the novels that do this, though, Ekwenzi's Divided We Stand is the one that places the most responsibility for the futile struggle of self-determination squarely on external forces. So what he calls the British recolonization of Nigeria and international politics. What shifts in this particular one is that, in this particular novel, is that unlike the others, or to a larger degree, he places a fair amount of responsibility on the Organization of African Unity. So there's a critique, as I say, there's a chapter in it called Afri-Chaos, where he tells the story of the Biafran War through the failures of the Organization of African Unity, and in particular through the commitment of the Organization of African Unity to territorial integrity and its inability to come to terms with what is perceived as being the racial nature of the support for, or the attempts to thwart the self-determination of Biafra for reasons of a global color line. So in the novel, for example, Ekwenzi understands the failure of Biafra to self-determine as follows. He says, "To the world, nothing should ever empower a black man to alter the boundaries handed over to him at independence by the colonial masters." So the problem with Biafra is that they didn't follow the rules. The rules are you get to be a state, but you only get to be a state in the borders that we left you, and you only get to be a state with international law. There's no other alternative you can imagine. And for Ekwenzi, this is the lesson of Biafra. This is the lesson, and the failure of the OAU is tied to its commitment. It's a parody, really. The Afri-Chaos chapter is a parody of the OAU sitting and talking, but no one can ever get outside of the language of international law and the language of territorial integrity. So what Ekwenzi's Divided We Stand allows us to do is to think about how do we get from The Dark Princess, which is a romantic internationalism, to The Wreath to Adomo, which is a sort of tragic Pan-Africanism, and possibly with the possibility of some type of organizational United States of Africa, to what is essentially a parody of Pan-Africanism through the OAU, right? Through a club of leaders who have no interest in assisting the Biafrans. It's a talk shop. It's described in verse as just a continuation of another hostile international body. And if you think of that continuation, the story of how you get there, and this is a story that Quincy highlights, well, doesn't highlight, but it's a backstory to how you get to Afro-Chaos, is the formation of the OAU in 1963. So what happens, just by way of backstory, what you might call the romantic internationalism, the alternative visions, alternative ways of political and legal ordering that are constant from Du Bois all the way to Nkrumah, come up to a head in 1963 when there's a meeting to form an organization of unity. Nkrumah is very keen on the idea, and there's lots of politics behind this, but Nkrumah is very keen on the idea of some kind of United States of Africa. He's opposed in this by a series of states that are called the Monrovia group. So he's the Casablanca group, which is easy to remember. He's the romantic Casablanca, and the other group's called Monrovia. And Monrovia is made up of various states, including Nigeria and Ethiopia and Liberia. And this has been written many times over, and there's various different ways that fight plays out, and the reasons for that fight as well. But part of the fight is two different visions of what the international legal order should be. So the vision of Nkrumah that he gets from Du Bois and from Padmore is a vision that's not necessarily committed just to states. It's a vision where law is not at the forefront. Law is possibly how you might regulate relations with other states, but it's not central to it. It doesn't constitute that order. The vision that comes from the other group, from the Monrovia group, is very much informed by that idea, the liberal international order, and it's informed in very direct ways. So two of the biggest supporters of the Monrovia group, Ethiopia and Liberia, already have their sovereignty. So there's no sense that they're going to give up their sovereignty. They've been sovereign for 100 odd years. They have no interest in forming an organization or United States of Africa and some kind of new way of organizing themselves. They also have treaty obligations. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who's the Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister of Nigeria, and arguably the first international lawyer. So he has a really interesting history. He studied at Lincoln University in the States. He tried to work for Liberia and Ethiopia, so when he finished law school, he's the first person, I think the first African international law in terms of teaching, so he teaches international law in 1933-34 at Lincoln University in African history. He tries to get a job with Liberia and Ethiopia, and they both say we don't employ people unless they can A, pay for themselves as diplomats, or B, they are from Ethiopia. He then writes to Turkey, strangely, and says, can I have a job, Turkey? And they write back saying, you sound like you have a nice CV, but no thanks. And then he writes the League of Nations. So he writes, this is the first, if you think of it from the contemporary perspective, the first independent leader of Nigeria, one of the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism, wrote to the League of Nations in 1935 to ask for a job. And it's when that all fails, when his international career, which was his first plan, his first love, fails, he goes and pursues politics through his newspaper empire and eventually rises to the ranks. Anyway, so he comes into the story in 1963 as someone who's been trained in that very orthodox understanding of international law and the commitment to territorial integrity. He has a particular vision of Pan-Africanism which is tied up to sovereign equality, human rights, and territorial integrity. And it's that part of the story that's not told in the clash between these two rival political blocs. There were definitely rivalries, of course, between Ghana, of course, and Nigeria and Ethiopia, and there were reasons why there was a fear about disintegration. If we abandoned the colonial borders, what would come after those? But part of the story is a story of international law, and one of the ways that this happens very practically is the very first draft of the Organization of African Unity's Charter comes in a ready drafted form because the Ethiopian president or emperor contacts someone in South America and gets a South American lawyer to do a kind of mock-up draft. And in that draft are all the things that you expect, territorial integrity, human rights, and the rest of it, right? So that's part of, there's practical ways that the two visions, when they clash in 1963, it's the international liberal order that survives. And that's kind of what's been parodied in De Quincy's novel, that what happens if we commit ourselves to this order, which is clearly not going to work in our interest, and we start having these collapsing states, or we start having groups start to self-determine. There's no ways we can deal with that because we fixed ourselves into a particular system of law that's based on sovereignty and territorial integrity. Right? And it's the inability of the Afro-Chaos, or the Organization of African Unity, to think outside of those structures that De Quincy is so critical of. And so when you think of the novels alongside, when you think of the almost immense romantic kind of naivety, utopianism of Du Bois, and you think of the more pragmatic but still quite utopian vision of Nkrumah, and you get to Biafra, there's a big drop-off. And part of that story, I think, of the drop-off is in the way that international comes into the picture. In practical ways, as another practical way just comes to mind, in the 1960s, there was a number of conferences in Lagos hosted by the Nigerian government, funded by the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, on the rule of law, on the rule of world peace through international law, world peace through law. There was conferences where they brought a whole bunch of lawyers from around the continent to try and extol the virtues of a universal rule of law. Right? So this is not, and at the time this was the one point of contestation between Nigeria and Ethiopia, is Lagos wanted to become the Geneva of Africa, and so they had these conferences to try generate interest and commitment to the rule of law, and that's definitely also part of the story. Alongside other things, so Nkrumah had perhaps been involved in the assassination of one of the neighboring heads of state, and that was part of why he was called, I think the Nigerian ambassador at the time called him Africa's Hitler, because he was trying to take over the whole continent. So there's a whole lot to the story, but international was certainly part of it. And the part that Akwenzi focuses on is in particular this idea of territorial integrity, and the tragedy of a commitment to territorial integrity over the suffering of the people of Biafra. So what's interesting about these three novels put together is that in all of them there's two kind of common ideas. Well, the first two, all of them there's a common theme, which is that the way that the international is positioned and imagined is always already as constituted by race, as a racist kind of white world supremacy. So this is the white world that Du Bois says that we live outside of in Pan-Africa in 1921 in his essay. This is the world constituted in Ruth Fuadomo by the idea that the only rival that this state or the organized or the continent, the only rival they have is actually the South Africans. There's no Cold War in this story. There's no Cold War in the story that's told about at least by Abrahams, about Ghana. It's all about South Africa, and ultimately the tragedy of the story, whether it be Ghana or Pan-Africa, is that they signed an agreement with Pluralia of South Africa, and they exchanged information about a so-called terrorist, and that led to the downfall of the death of both would-be Kenyatta and the death of with Fuadomo at the end, and kind of a really bloody murder scene. So the enemy without wasn't the Cold War, it was race or global racism or white settler colonialism, and that's common across all the novels. The same is true of Biafra. The international that Biafrans, or at least Biafran writers at the time, imagine as one that's shot through with race. It's not an international, that's the Cold War. Even the support for the Cold War, and the support of both Cold War powers against Biafra and on the side of Nigeria is understood in racial terms. Right? So this is again this is the white world deciding, regardless of their ideological differences, that you can't have black self-determination outside the borders that we've agreed to. And this is precisely that. This is common across many of the novels. So that's the one, and that's what gets lost in 1963 when the OAU commits to this idea of a liberal, formally and non-racist liberal political order in states that are territorially bound, as determined by colonialism. Then race becomes something that they struggle to deal with. And this is not about the high point of this, the example where, and this is the tragedy perhaps of it, is in 1966 when South Africa essentially wins the decision, the Southwest Africa decision, essentially on a technicality, but writes a book about it at home saying it won the decision essentially. And the tragedy is that the OAU sits between the two decisions of Southwest Africa. So the first decision is one that suggests maybe international might be on your side, and there's this commitment in 1963 to say, well, let's try international law, and then you have the 66 decision where it's clearly not the case. And the problems with committing to that particular judicial ordering and that liberal order is showed up by the inability of the African states to sue South Africa for apartheid essentially, and to have the court come down in their favor. Although it's a technical decision, the way it's understood, certainly in South Africa, was a redemption of apartheid, and outside of South Africa and the rest of the continent, it was showed the flaws of the liberal order, but one that they had already committed to in the OAU in 1963. So that's the one. And the other thing that's common to both of them, and this is something that I picked up in the beginning, is this idea of alternative political and legal forms, right? So do you think of Pan-Africa as in being in what Du Bois calls a geographical third dimension, that there's other ways to think about this outside of the things that are given to us, other languages we can use outside of international law. And in this sense, this is where the novels become very powerful, because what happens after Biafra in the novels is a resurgence of, or a commitment to thinking very seriously about whether or not English is a language that can be used for African fiction. So if you think of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe didn't write another novel after Biafra for about 20 years, and he himself said he had to look back and question whether or not English was a language that was friendly to the experience, were you able to communicate effectively your ideas in English. So there's a shift after Biafra, and in the 70s, at least a more concrete questioning of the colonial forms. And you have the exact opposite in international law. So the tragedy of Biafra is that not only were both the great powers on the side of Nigeria, but both the big international lawyers were as well. So the end of Biafra, you have this amazing moment where the first president or the first African judge on the International Court of Justice, Louis Mbenefo, who was on the South West Africa decision, was fighting on the side of Biafra, and he lost, and he had to surrender to the most famous African International Court Justice, Theo Elias, who was who was working for the federal government. And so in that sort of beautiful poetic moment, you have the surrendering of one vision of international law and to some extent the triumph of another. And Elias writes after the Biafra, what he calls the Nigerian Civil War, he writes a strong defense of the Nigerian government, where all he's really interested in is oil concessions, about how Biafra shouldn't have got oil concessions. So he performs, he sort of parodies that idea of a post-colonial international lawyer. And the third thing, I guess, that's interesting in both the first and the second, and the third novels, in fact all of them, is the role of South Africa. So South Africa plays this role of white state, white spoiler states. South Africa is present certainly in all the Biafran novels. Many of the bad guys are white mercenaries, but mostly from South Africa. In fact, the beginning and end of Akwensi, the novels, the Divided We Stand, Divided We Fall. It's not Divided We Fall. Divided We Stand, yes, Divided We Stand, begins with a conference about apartheid and ends with an international conference about Biafra. So there's a sense of even in the politics, there's this shot through with concerns about South Africa. One of the shorter novels, and I'll end with this, one of the short stories or novella that's written by Kolo Omotso on Biafra is called The Combat. And it essentially tells the story of Biafra of Nigeria in allegorical form, two brothers who have started fighting. And the two brothers, or two friends who are brothers, variously described as friends, and they have a fight over something minor. And it turns out they both might be the father of this 10-year-old child, and then they decide they're going to have a combat to fight it out. Right? And you can imagine this 10-year-old child as independence or whatever, oil, or it can be anything you want it to be. But essentially the combat is staged, and the international community gets involved and builds a stadium for this combat between Biafra and Nigeria, and the humanitarians are waiting in the wings to support the people. The tragedy of the novel is that the whole time the child's already dead. But what happens in the novel is you have this invocation of the international, where the Nigerian side goes to the Russian ambassador and says to the Russian ambassador, can I have support for my cause in my fight against Biafra, or allegorically Biafra? And then the Russian ambassador says, yes, of course you can. The only thing I require from you in exchange is that when you win, which of course you will because you're wonderful, that the child that you're fighting over must come to Russia to get schooled. So that's a typical explanation of Russian support. Now the other side, the Biafran character goes to the South African ambassador. And the South African ambassador wines and dines him and says, of course you're going to win, we're going to give you all your support. And in exchange for your support, the South African ambassador says that all we want when you win the fight is if you give us the child, which is to say, you give up everything. So starting with the Cold War comes with a cost perhaps of ideological implications. Starting with South Africa, at least allegorically, comes with the loss of the very thing you're fighting for. And I think that's something that runs throughout, certainly through the second and the third novels, as the role of South Africa as kind of this emblematic, as the conflation of these two things that Du Bois is trying to escape from, to reimagine the world as not a white world supremacy, and to reimagine the world without states. And South Africa is then the conflation of those two things. South Africa is a state that embodies that very world you're trying to reimagine. Thank you.
Michael, do you want to do Q&A?
Yes.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of questions. But so thanks for this beautiful revisionist history through these three texts. But behind the text is obviously real choices about historical methodology. A lot of archival research is going on. A lot of meta history is going on. Can you share with us, what were some of the choices and places what is your historical methodology? What did you have to do? Can you tell us that story?
So, that's a great question. I guess the novels are performing two things. So the way I come to this is to trying to write an intellectual history of Pan-Africanism, and finding out that many of the people involved wrote novels, and thinking, well, that's fun to read the novels, so I don't have to just read revolutions the whole time. And the novels turn out to be kind of in some way related to the things that, The Dark Princess was an obvious example. There's a clear connection between the loss of faith in Pan-Africanism and this attempt to rewrite as success in The Dark Princess. Ruth Dodoma as well is kind of somewhere between an intellectual history, because Peter Abrahams is present in Manchester and knows the character and has all sorts of insights that are remarkable. But it's his own visions as what he thought Pan-African was going to be. So it's kind of part archive and part his own imagining. So it's part intellectual history and part just archival. Cyprian Equenzi is slightly different. So Equenzi is an attempt to, because he's not directly involved in any way, right? So this is just saying, hey, this is a fun way to think about Biafra. There's no fun way to think about Biafra, but an interesting way to think about Biafra is through novels. And that's just through going through all the novels on Biafra and finding this one had a particular gripe with the organization of African unity. So the methodology starts as device. How do I teach this in an interesting way? How do I make this readable? Novels are fun, and then they somehow at some point start becoming archive, and then they become intellectual history. And so that's actually that's the difficulty with using it that's why I call it vignettes, or we're thinking sort of more broadly, because there's obviously methodological problems with moving between them, and so I have to find out how those boundary lines are drawn. I think in Du Bois in particular, because he doesn't have really a legal story there. Du Bois' story is fascinating, that the law never comes into it. He studies in Germany. I've gone through all of Du Bois' stuff. The closest I can come is that he wrote a piece in a piece that he never published, I think, at the end of the 1890s, 1895, 1896, about the slave trade and liquor, where he does some kind of discussion of international diplomacy, and he cites a lot of international textbooks in his thesis, but he never does anything with international law. And then there's a reference in one of his biographies that when he was in Germany studying, he was in an international reading group. But aside from that, international just disappears from Du Bois, from the story. And I think that's, if you think of what he was trying to do, and he did this consistently. From 1900, Pan-Africanism comes later, but he went to the Universal Racist Congress in 1919 and declared it the greatest event of the 20th century, but for World War I. He thought the only way to make the world a better place is through this reverend of international people. And he was there with international lawyers. In fact, I think he had a contempt for them, because he came back, he was at the time the editor of the Crisis magazine, and he came back and gave a special issue, the very first anniversary issue. I actually have a little pendant from it that I managed to find online. So the very first issue of the anniversary issue he has is specifically on the Universal Racist Congress, where he extols the virtues of internationalism. And he summarizes all the papers he found interesting. And there's the only papers that don't make it in there, bar a few others, are all the international lawyers. So whether he skipped the session or was hungover or didn't go to that day of the conference, for whatever reason, Du Bois didn't have an international story, which is why with him it's easier. As a straightforward intellectual history, I think the novel is part of that. I think it's more difficult to try make the argument with others where there is a firmer international story, and what is a novel? How do I mediate the divide between the archive, this is just background, or this is just imagination, or this is just intellectual history, and how does it come into law? Because then it becomes much more regulated by what I can and can't cite. So I'm trying to be capacious with it at the moment, but at some point, I think certainly in Biafra the story is, I know it's a really long answer to your question. Biafra's fascinating as a story because the novels of Biafra are shot through with international law, and insights that today would pass as novel, even for critically novel, right? So Biafra novels written, there's about 29 novels written about Biafra, by Biafrans themselves at the time and since, and every major Nigerian novelist has written about Biafra. And many of them are just barely beneath the surface are critiques of international diplomacy, of recognition of states, of humanitarianism, genocide. I mean, there's a lot. It's very articulate. There's a lot of international literacy in the Biafra novels that I think is really interesting to think about how that comes in and when. So that's a bit easier. And Peter Abrahams is just it's a fun novel, and it's also one that people don't really read. I mean, it's not even in the biography of post-colonial fiction. Abrahams isn't even there because he's there, but Ruth Verdoma is not even there. It just sort of falls off. And to me, it's the most fascinating because it's set not only in Manchester, but it's set at a particular time. And it's just to read as a novel, to read it knowing that it's actually most of the stuff you think is fictional, is historical, hasn't happened. So he nails exactly what's going to happen with a kind of prescience. It's kind of unnerving. And that's what's, even to the extent that he knows exactly there's going to have to be a big dam project, and that the South Africans are going to start giving advice, and he gets it. And I don't know how. I'm interested to see how he became a soothsayer. But yeah, so that's a very long. The point is, there's no methodology, but it's fun to do.
Obviously, this is not my particular area, so I'm thinking through your talk in the terms of what I know about Pan-Asianism, right, going on at the same time. And I think one of the aspects of these different types of imaginations is they are in many ways imagining for others, right? And Pan-Asianism doesn't have even the same type of like consistent intellectual world in which people, there's writers in India and writers in China grappling with these ideas. And ironically, it's Japan that takes on the mantle of Pan-Asianism, but because it's not in a post-colonial context in the same way, it's articulated through this language of empire and recapturing empire. So the language of Pan-Asianism is not recapturing something for ourselves for its own sake, it's recapturing something for ourselves to then reassert on the rest of the world, right? And that's why the Japanese portray their sort of military invasions as in part of this like Pan-Asian language. Which is, in a military sense, very much imagining things for others. So I'm curious about, in this context, what sort of like, if there's any idea of democratization, right, and democracy and process, of how they imagine this sort of, this state coming into being, and just a procedural level. Right now that has sort of liberal undertones, right?
Yeah.
They have that this mechanism. But the failure of Pan-Asianism was the resort to military violence as a way of how we're going to constitute this other, right? So I'm just curious in these things is beyond sort of rejecting sort of a liberal proceduralism. How did they imagine this come? Especially someone like Du Bois, who's essentially an outsider, right? He may not imagine himself in that way, but he's an American. Yeah. In an era where Americans are doing this type of imagining in all sorts of different types of ways. And so I'm sort of curious what sort of, if it's as utopian writing, but whether they had any sort of idea of how that constitutive process would emerge.
So to the first part, I mean, about Du Bois. Du Bois is particularly interesting because there's a aspect of this, right? So Du Bois's idea, the idea that to redeem, you go back to Souls of Black Folk, and the idea of double consciousness and the second sight, that Black Americans have a second sight because they've been beyond the veil, they can see themselves, and so they have a knowledge of the world, and particularly a racialized world that white America doesn't have. And this is part of the idea of how it's not just about Africa coming to the table. We're going to save the whole of civilization because we've been on the wrong side of white civilization and we know precisely how to deal with it. So there's a sense that there's a diasporic story that comes into Nkrumah, and Nkrumah has this idea of African personality, which is also a unique experience-based, or perhaps with him a bit more of a nationalist idea, that it's not just that we want to be equal, it's that Africa has a particular role to play in the salvation of humanity. I think Nkrumah might have moved a bit more towards empire, I think certainly in his sort of regional politics. In terms of, this was precisely one of the points that people made about with Nkrumah, was, how's this going to happen? What you're saying is that I should be the president of Africa and we'll figure it out. You're not saying that we should go for Munus Unit. There was a sense that this was a gradual process. So the middle liners were saying, that people like Anyere and others were saying, well, the goal is always going to be United States of Africa, but we have to federalize first sort of in our regions, and then from our regions we have to grow into something more, which is kind of how regional integration works in Africa today, right? You have these various, multiple different overlapping sub-regional economic communities. So there was some that had thought kind of seriously about it, the process of going from federal and beyond. But it didn't really get out the starting blocks because there wasn't much of a plan. I think to some extent Padmore had thought about this because he had written about Russia and how Russia there's a particular, there's something in Padmore I have to think about, but there wasn't much from Nkrumah's side. It was just saying, well, look, we can start with West Africa or we can start with the whole continent, but we know that ultimately this is what we have to do. And that was one of the things that people were saying, one of the critiques, the less political critiques would say, well, just practically, how does this happen? And I think even today that's possibly still where regional integration is. Well, do we do economy? Do we do politically? But certainly always legally was always part of the equation.
I was just watching that James Meredith document, not James Meredith from Mississippi, James Baldwin documentary, where they the book that never ended up coming out, right? And in it he talks about this idea of whiteness as a metaphor for power.
Mm.
So being white is just a metaphor for power that operates in different ways, and his argument was, in the United, at least part of his argument, I think, in the United States at least, was that the problem was brother was killing brother in the same house, and that the white people had to start looking at how was it that they were willing to accept that they're killing their brother, and that the problem was rooted there in a national need for internal self-reflection among, it wasn't a race problem per se, it was something much more specific. And he would always turn the question on people when they did that. And in your story, it seems like there's constantly this tension between it being a race issue or a class issue, whether it's internationalism, which is just Europe, or is it something, right? That goes on. So I'm interested, for you, when you're, coming from South Africa and very much involved in many ways, committed to this sort of thinking about oneself in a context of this larger tensions and story, and having lived with that and reflecting on that, albeit imperfectly like everyone, what would you say moving forward is the way that you would recommend, how do you think about the politics of moving forward as a scholar, or as, as us as in academic institutions, what's, so that we don't write our tragedy in 20 years, what's your feeling about that?
That's a good question. So, I'll avoid the difficult question first and come back to it. So the class question is unquestionably Du Bois had an elitist problem, and telling the story of Pan-Africanism with Du Bois is then avoiding the Garvey story, which is a different story altogether. And the way I kind of get around that is that the international law story is also always an elitist story. So it's not to say this is the only story of Pan-Africanism, but it's the one that runs the most parallel. It's Du Bois who's at Versailles, Du Bois who's thinking he can do what internationalists do, which is to write treaties that reimagine the world and order it, and it's just not working for him for various reasons. And a really powerful parallel for Du Bois is Jan Smuts. So Jan Smuts, very similar background, academically brilliant, studies in Germany. They're also both present at Versailles. They're also both present at San Francisco with the UN. And they have this double life, and Smuts bats way above his league because he's a white South African who people in London love him because he rides horses and he knows and he reads Kant and he does various other things. And Du Bois is brilliant, who's the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard and just doesn't ever get anywhere near. Just is always on the fringes. So that's part of the story. These are two elite discourses, and race is the thing that means one, to me at least, the defining line is not that one is a diplomat, one's not, because much of Jan Smuts' influence had nothing to do with his positions. It's the things he wrote, and he got invited to places, and he got invited into decision-making spaces at the time that Du Bois would never have been allowed into. So the elite thing is accepted, and there's some critiques of Biafra as well. The Biafra novels are written. Biafra is a class war essentially, and the Biafra novels are all written from the wrong side of that war. And the Baldwin, it's a tough question, man. So I will say that Baldwin was one of the people who was commenting on during Rhodesian independence about how the international community only got involved and started worrying when it was white bodies started showing up, right? So there was he understood this the same way that Biafra understood it, the same way that Césaire understood the Congo, and it's using the Congo as primarily being about race, not about the Cold War. where we go ahead, I don't know, man. I would say that what makes the story for me personally powerful is a white South African who's trying to unpack white supremacy in a context where that's becoming more accepted, but we're trying to chart our way and find as an academic as well. There's something about the story of international that even I think critical internationals missed. I think race, the way that race comes into that story, not just empire but race. I think Du Bois had a handle on this earlier than anyone else. So Du Bois wrote an essay in 1910 called The Souls of White Folk, which is kind of a response to The Souls of Black Folk. He gives a solid description about the new religion of whiteness washing up on our shores and how it is actually an international issue, that race and the constitution of white supremacy happens internationally through states, through diplomacy. So to my mind, part of recovering Du Bois is trying to bring that into the story, the critical story of international law, is to think about how central race was, how central South Africa was as a white state understood as such. And I think, so that's part of me trying to understand my own sort of white supremacy in South Africa, but trying to work within the discipline that I came into the academy in, is to try to think of white supremacy as a global phenomenon and how that might intersect with international law. And I think Du Bois has done that better than, it's certain to me, he's been the most consistently critical, as understanding race is always already globally constituted, and race and law as having a relationship. So I think that would be my project, is somehow trying to come to terms with it on with a set of tools that I might have that others might not, because I've been trained in international law, but it's a study in sort of white supremacy, I'd imagine.
Pan-Africanism, I mean, the whole idea of trying to help Africa to, evolve in a way, post-colonial, or just before the war and all that. And then you've talked about Cyprian Quincy and his Divided We Stand, which is basically going against this forced nationalism that is kind of gluing Africans together, disregarding their different classes and their different ethnicities, their different groups, and just trying to lump them all together, which is, in fact, principally what is causing most of the problems in Africa today. Now, my question is, how do you balance that Pan-Africanism, which is kind of ignored completely, the fact that these Africans are different, and just looking at them as Africans, disregarding the fact that false nationalism is what is actually causing these problems, because forcing them to live together, it's not working. So how do you balance these two?
So how do I balance? I don't balance these two. In my story, how do those two relate? I think that's a great critique of Du Bois, because he doesn't go to Africa until 1921, 22, and he goes there tragically as an envoy for the president to try to thwart Marcus Garvey's mission to make connections with Liberia. So Du Bois doesn't, and I don't think has the same sense of place and the same sense of the differentiation. I think Africa is, for Du Bois, in his mind at least, there's one world. And I think that's his experience of as being, as I say, it's a diasporic understanding of race as being primarily sort of over ethnicity or over other nationalisms, race being the one that he needs to focus on. How you do that more generally, I can't say. I mean, Quincy's novel is interesting because Quincy's novel, The Divided We Stand, is about the false nationalism and the false nationalism of Nigeria as what was called a mere geographic expression. Right? So Nigeria was not actually a state. It was simply created by the British and then allowed to unfold by the British, and perhaps orchestrated by the British if you read Quincy's. But also, The Divided We Stand is also about Africa. So the chapter on Afro-Chaos, I think Divided We Stand is trying to critique also how somehow through the organization of African unity or through perhaps some Cold War machinations, and definitely through the influence of the states involved. So France is on Biafra, South Africa's coming in, Israel's coming in as well. There's a sense that the Divided We Stand is not just about Nigeria, but it's about the whole continent and the OAU. That this is kind of it's the inability of the organization of African unity in the clear sort of context of many people dying, inability to even get into an honest debate about it, that they're stuck in these ideas of territorial integrity, and they're stuck in a particular language that's just not compatible, not able to do the things they need to do. So, to my mind, there's a story of Divided We Stand that speaks to the politics of Africa more generally. I don't know how. I mean, if you got some ideas, I'll hear you out. I have no idea. I don't know how you overcome that ultimately. I think what I'm interested in is to say that these attempts, as utopian as they were, had some kind of resonance, right? And I just think someone, at the very least, people should read more Du Bois. I think that's my ultimate conclusion, is that people should read more fiction and more great literature about people like Quincy, and people should read Du Bois, and then people can figure it out amongst themselves, I think.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. Well, you might be also as prescient as Du Bois himself, or Peter Abrahams, because we just landed from Nigeria.
Okay.
And right now there's a lot of military action back home, because I'm from the eastern part of what was originally Biafra. So there's a lot of secessionist movement right now. There's military action from the States. And he's asking you, how do you balance that? Well, we're trying to balance that back home with very limited success, because even right now, you find the same problem in 1966 with playing itself, which is the inability of the elites to define Africanism ab initio. The dilemma is their fault, because the borders, even though false, turned out to be their sort of first position in the fight against colonialism. So they sold the dream to the people of this state that belongs to us, even though they knew the borders were false. But after the white man left, the problem of legitimacy on those borders, which they had never resolved, came up to play in Biafra. And the indecision of the African elite to say, do we once and for all agree that these borders are fake, do away with them? What's the solution? In that indecision, the dominant international order took sides, and we live with the results till today. So going forward, like he was asking, for us younger Africans, maybe I might even say, if the war had changed, I might have been a Biafran, is that until the elites are able to define for us, or I should count myself as one of the elites now, until we're able to define an Africanism that is certainly beyond territories and certainly beyond race, we would always struggle with those borders. And there is no easy solution, coming out of them. Claude Ake tries to point out that intellectual emptiness of the elites post-colonialism. Because now the white man is gone, what next? What's the ideology moving forward? Enmity against the white man can be a strategy for development, and that's what Africa has learned very painfully over the years. Cyprian Quincy points to that crack in Pan-Africanism by saying divided we stand, because the quarrel between Nyerere, Nkrumah, and Zik was, okay, Pan-Africanism is good unless I'm president.
Yeah.
And that was, on that quarrel, on that each singular issue, they killed Pan-Africanism amongst themselves. Zik's rejection in Ethiopia and Liberia was not rejection at the hands of a white man. It was his fellow Africans who rejected him in those places. And if we check in the UN, it might have been a black man who signed the rejection paper. But the truth is that we haven't really sat down to be honest with ourselves, especially the elites, those of us who should know better. Ojukwu writes that in his book, Because I'm Involved, and lays the blame squarely at the feet of the African elites for their inability to decide to put aside their selfishness and actually face the truth. So that frustration, that inability of these intellectual thinkers to actually bridge that human fault is why a lot of times you find the resort to military technology to actually forge some kind of control, in Africa repeatedly. Just like he mentioned with the Pan-Asianism, why they had to eventually resort to those military interventions, because that was the most efficient way to actually bring this structure to pass. Economically, politically, it takes too much time. There's too much. It's not a walk in the park. We might as well be at it for the next 100 years. But these are the realities, sadly.
So, if I could ask, when you blame the elites, the African elites, and you talk about these postalities and borders, independence that were acquired must be how nobody can change them, and this is principally the problem, because, as I said, Biafra has to live with the rest of Nigeria, whether they like it or not. And just because of this principle that was left after colonialism, they have to stay there like that. So I'm trying to, understand, where do the elites actually take the blame from here?
Selfishness.
But they can't change the borders.
They can't.
As they were, and that's why they are trying to do, and they're not getting any result.
It's selfishness. If you take out the selfishness, then the elites can present a common front. That's why Quincy's title is prescient. Divided we stand. Africa has learned to stand in division. They haven't learned to stand in unity. And that's because of selfishness. Even in Biafra right now, the guy who's leading the secessionist movement, he can't even galvanize the whole southeastern Nigeria. Some of us don't agree with him. Some of us don't agree with his methods. Some of the things he's espousing are really not what we want to live with or give to our children for the next 50, 60 years. And without the support of intellectuals like us, that struggle is not going to last very long. It's not sustainable, to be honest. And that's because, it all goes back to the selfishness. Because a lot of these guys are career politicians. Without this struggle, they have nothing else to turn to. So they seek to use it to not just legitimize their own political infrastructure, but to keep themselves at the foot of the pyramid, at the top of the pyramid. So selfishness back in game. So.
If we can let that be the last word and we can carry on after.
Yeah.
I know Jean can't be here, but he's in here in spirit. And Ian and John, thanks for creating the space. And Chris, thanks for being here.
Sure, thanks,
Yeah, thanks again, mate.